All right. Welcome back, everyone, to the Equitable Wellness Podcast. It's been a minute since the last episode, but I'm grateful we're all getting caught up. If you're watching along on Substack or YouTube, you can find the full episode notes online on Substack at Equitable Wellness, and you can subscribe to support this work, join the community, and have new episodes dropped right into your inbox. If you prefer to read, a full transcript will be available on my website blog, shaynagraho.com, link in the notes. So, also for those of you listening along on any other podcast player, welcome. Today, I am so honored to invite my next guest, who is Sheena Sood. You can celebrate her holistic being in this podcast episode because, and I'm reading my little notes along here, Sheena is a scholar, an educator, a writer, a healer, a visionary, and a yogi, among multiplicitous other things. So first, as a scholar, let me note that Sheena Sood, PhD, who uses she and her pronouns, is an assistant professor of sociology at Delaware Valley University and a Philly-based activist scholar. Her research, Omwashing yoga, self-care, and state violence among the global far right, examines how right-wing movements in India, Israel, and the US appropriate yoga to advance ethno-national, colonial, and supremacist agendas. Sheena is an educator and earned her yoga certifications at Kailash Tribal School in Meklung, India. I think I have to edit that. uh, or not. She teaches decolonizing yoga workshops at yoga teacher training programs and facilitates healing justice programs for community groups. She is a writer who writes about the liberatory potential of yoga, social movements, immigrant and racial justice organizing, and abolition. Something about reading that sentence just makes me want to give the good old fist pump. Her work has appeared in Jadaliya, Race and Yoga Journal, Al Jazeera, and the edited volumes Practicing Yoga as Resistance, Voices of Color in Search of Freedom, and the Yoga Teacher Survival Guide, Social Justice, Science, Politics, and Power. Sheena serves on the editorial board of Race and Yoga Journal. Sheena is a healer who is a co-founder of Yogis for Palestine, a collective of yoga teachers and students who politicize yoga toward action for Palestinian freedom and liberation. She also facilitates sound healing and radical healing workshops for youth and adults. As a visionary, she is founder of Yoga Warrior Tales, an educational program that teaches kids yoga and mindfulness through a social justice lens. And finally, last but certainly not least, as a yoga practitioner, she is deeply committed to her practice personally, ancestrally, and professionally. Her work weaves storytelling, social justice, academic research, children's education, and activism through a decolonial and liberatory lens. I am so grateful to welcome not just an expert to the show, but an artist and human being in her full expression. So welcome, Sheena. Um, you're gonna have the longest, right, prelude. So tell us, where are you calling in from today?
Um, I'm here in Philadelphia, otherwise known as the occupied territories of the Lenni Lenape Hoking people, people who have stewarded the land for thousands of years prior to European colonization. And yeah, so I'm really grateful to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on the Equitable Wellness podcast.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you for coming. I always think to myself, because I'm actually calling in from Algeciras in the south of Spain, in the Campo de Gibraltar, very close to the Rock of Gibraltar. Um, I always think I should draft a land statement for where I'm at in Spain. And that has not come to pass. But I think about that. But yes, there are so many rich layers of history. I believe the very original peoples of the Iberian Peninsula were the Iberians. But I'd have to look more into the history books. Um, but yeah, it's a good question to have. Okay, this conversation is bound to be deep. I'm taking my swig of water, so you know it's bound to be deep. Um, I always have personally felt challenged by the tension and holding this tension of both the profound effects of yoga practice for mind, body, spirit, lineage, community, and tradition, and the unsettling feelings of the topics of appropriation versus appreciation, the commercialization of yoga, yoga fascism, as I like to call it, and things I couldn't quite name through my history as a practicing person, such as the patriarchy and the casteism. I have always embraced the spiritual and physical transformations of yoga that I've observed in myself and many people, my peers, as I've practiced and taught the internationally popular Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga for 15 years, if not more. And I do identify as a biracial practitioner of Southeast Asian descent. And thus, for me, I never had quite the same fanaticism and draw to India and a pilgrimage to India as others of European ancestry. And of course, I do carry European ancestry myself. Um, so I instead, in my journey, made Portugal my India and studied abroad here on these shores where I currently reside in the Iberian Peninsula. All right. And this is also part of why this will be a juicy episode because I am sure that listeners and readers of this conversation are going to tune in as well for your inputs on these very pressing topics. But of course, this for me is a personal episode too because it impacts something I've been contemplating and wrestling with for a long time. All right. So, to me, Sheena is an embodiment of the antidote to the discomforts that I've felt about yoga all along for so many years. And by this, I mean, as somebody who is an ancestrally integrated practitioner with a PhD, um, and is conscious of justice, equity, and liberation work on a broader global scale, I feel that she helps to give voice to things that I haven't been able to articulate for myself, and probably many others haven't quite been able to articulate these feelings of dis-ease and discomfort around whether for as a yoga teacher or as a practitioner, these topics of being around yoga, what it means to hold yoga in one's life. Um, and she wields her critical lens and conscious positionality in pursuit of awakening true freedom for all, that timeless and elusive essence of yoga. Um, which I guess to start, that's my shorthand definition of yoga is freedom. Um, now that's again not a researched definition from a scholarly perspective, or somebody with letters behind my name. But that's just my understanding today,
Your aspiration, even. Yeah.
or my aspiration to
Hmm.
feel right, for myself and, of course, in a collective capacity. So we'll
Yeah.
get to some of those questions later as well. Some different ways to think about all of the collective care and personal care conversation. So let's just get started with where did your journey with yoga and spiritual, well, I'll say spiritual practice, but also social justice, where did that all begin?
Yeah. Thank you, Shayna, for that really sweet and generous introduction and for just taking the time to read out to me how you see me. It's so generous. Um, I'm really excited to be here today. My journey with yoga and social justice began, I would say, maybe in my 20s or so. I'm 40 right now. I started learning yoga from my grandmother when I would go visit her in India in my teens. She would teach me mantras. She would teach me Sanskrit mantras when I would go visit her, and kind of very simple yoga practices. She would also watch uh, these television channels with this really famous spiritual personality who now I write about in a more critical way. But she would watch these TV shows with someone in India who's revered named Baba Ramdev, um, and we would just kind of, it would be like our sacred way of connecting together, because I didn't speak much Hindi and Punjabi, which are the ancestral tongues that my parents and my grandparents speak. And so it kind of became our language for bonding, me learning Sanskrit from her, and then going on to practice yoga and try and connect to yoga through this kind of like religious pursuit, because I grew up in a family that wasn't necessarily um, devoted to, like, you know, teaching me Hinduism. And because I grew up in this kind of um, suburb that wasn't very diverse south of Atlanta, Georgia, I felt that this was my way of connecting to my ancestors, or this was my way of connecting to my identity and finding belonging, was to reach for the religion that um, I was born into. Yeah. Um, but then while I was in college, I started learning a little more about um, Hindu nationalism and Hindu fundamentalism, or like these really far right ways in which Hinduism or Hindu nationalism, which is also called and referred to as Hindutva ideology, kind of pervaded some of these spiritual practices and traditions and the subcontinent of India or South Asia. And I found that as I was getting politicized around some of these criticisms of the far right in India, and connecting more to a pathway of social justice, that I didn't find that I was able to really practice yoga. I kind of felt like I had to distance myself from Hinduism and from yoga. And while I still don't identify as a Hindu today, I kind of came back into yoga somewhat on my own terms when I was doing organizing in the South, with this organization called Highlander Research and Education Center. It was a popular education, social justice organizing center in East Tennessee that did a lot of work in the South. And a friend of mine who had come to work there, who's also an Ashtanga yogi, or was trained in that. Now I don't know if they would identify as an Ashtanga yogi. They invited me to come to this MLK Day yoga and social justice workshop. And I had, like, had left yoga for a couple years at that point, but then had slowly started practicing it again with my friend, Yardena. And then we went to this workshop together. And I just remember it having this really profound and powerful effect, to the point where I remember just in tears, being really moved by this opportunity to situate and to sort of combine yoga with a social justice lens of my choice. And then maybe a year after that, I had moved to Philly, which is where I now reside. So I've been in Philly for about 15 years now. And I started a PhD program and found that yoga was something that really anchored me. And so I had done yoga teacher trainings in India at the beginning of my stay in Philly, and had also gotten involved in Philly in these like political movements, particularly this movement called the Movement to Free Mumia Abu Jamal, who's a longtime political prisoner who used to organize with the Black Panthers in the 60s, who's a journalist, and someone who's been imprisoned now for over 44 years. But at the time when I started working with the campaign, it was coming up on like 30 or 31 years. And uh, and I found that the way in which I was teaching yoga or wanting to teach yoga was through this kind of liberatory lens of connecting the practice of yoga and our reflections during the practice to thinking about the incarceration of the unjust incarceration of people and how important it was to kind of use yoga as this tool to help people think about what does for if we're talking about yoga as this practice of freedom, as this practice of enlightenment, as this practice of liberation, it can't just be for individual liberation. We have to think about the importance of freedom for those who are unjustly incarcerated in a society and a system that profits off their incarceration. And so we would do like these yoga social justice fundraisers that were called, like, I think, Free Mumia, Free Your Mind, Free Mumia, Free Them All. And we would fundraise for the movement, but we would also offer yoga to movement organizers, which also became this pathway to kind of just fighting burnout, since so many organizers give so much of themselves to the movement. And so those were some of my first opportunities to kind of combine yoga and social justice. And then I think living in Philly has just kind of allowed me to continue to expand on what does that look like in various aspects of my life.
Mm. Well, thank you. I love the rundown.
Yes, apologies if it was long-winded.
No, I think it's good to have the arc of your life sketched. Because there's so many things, right, that I love about your journey. And you know, for those listening, like the full disclosure is we don't really know each other that well. I actually don't know Sheena's story from like a more from a perspective of like a chum or a friend or just somebody who's known her forever. I'm still coming to this myself, right? I'm discovering, oh, who is this person? And I mean, it's really uncanny. I feel there's some little exquisite details I'm going to draw out. One, that it seems like this kind of like arc of your yoga development and your yoga practice has always kind of organically and naturally been alongside your spiritual social justice practice of liberation. So it's really lovely that those things have gone together, hand in hand, which, for me, again, personally, I feel like this would just give so much more comfort and ease to the practice of yoga, is feeling this decolonial liberatory I don't know, angle, for lack of better words. Because I think for a lot of people, the idea of becoming an activist or radical or an organizer or politicizing is either, for some, like definitely not their idea of their path. But also, like in our climate today, right, there's just so much, whatever, political polarization, and things are just feeling so tense. But you have managed to kind of have this path in your life, which I think is just brilliant. From your upbringings in the South and you're going through your earlier education to carrying this on into Philly and just deepening that relationship with political organizing, that I think again is probably paralleled somewhere in the peace you're finding with the traditions of yoga as passed to you by your grandmother and by your culture, and these other kinds of threads of faith, threads of faith. um, so I feel like that's just such a rich context, especially as an illuminated, visible yoga teacher and a presence in the world, I feel like this is a presence and a medicine that a lot of communities are looking for. I mean, in our in the shit show of what's going on today. But I feel like it's been needed this whole time, and now that I think this synergy of all of these, interconnected ideas. What is liberation? Um, it's a great time for the intersections and the making of these links, connecting the dots. Um,
Thank you.
yeah, just my first reaction. Thank you for sharing. I absolutely love it. All right, because again, I think a lot of people are not always comfortable thinking about these harder hitting subjects, right? Incarceration and um, the fights that you have been on the ground for throughout your life. So I want to give you those props too. All right, let's get into, well, yoga as this tool for a lot of, relief of suffering. It is also something that propels it. And let's get into the term in your writing of omwashing and where this word came from and its context.
Yeah, absolutely. So how to talk about omwashing? So I should say that I think omwashing for me is this term that I came to through my exploration of looking at yoga through like a decolonial lens, right? Um, I want to kind of like rewind and then come back to the term omwashing if that's okay.
Yeah,
Um,
please.
you know, um, Having been someone who, and or who practiced yoga for most of my life, living in the United States, but who studied yoga in India, at the Kailash Tribal School in McLeodganj, India, in 2011 and in 2013, when I started doing yoga and social justice work, I found that, most of my attention around like wanting to couple yoga with social justice still went to thinking about the problematic aspects of cultural appropriation. Yeah. Like why do white women, wear bindis or get Ganesha tattoos kind of thing? Why can't they just learn how to pronounce namaste? Or why do they feel like they have to learn Sanskrit, right? Were some of kind of like the ways in which I thought about it. And I used to kind of romanticize yoga and yoga's philosophical roots, right? And I think it's easy growing up in the West to kind of glorify yoga in India as being ancient or yoga in India as being inherently social justicey. Um, but then as I kind of deepened my involvement in organizing, not just in circles that were working toward the liberation of political prisoners, but also deepening my work within South Asian American communities in the diaspora who were talking about things like casteism and Islamophobia and class-based oppression or economic oppression from upper class South Asians, and Hindu supremacy, right? I kind of started realizing the shortcomings of my analysis around mm, how I was thinking about decolonizing yoga. Yeah. So they would kind of basically point out how yoga is entangled with Hindu supremacy or yoga is entangled with casteism, right? And it forced me to kind of let go and actually develop a critique for the ways in which I was personally glorifying yoga's history and yoga's philosophical roots, right? So for instance, um it's been it's not very well known, but I write a little bit about how because yoga or because Sanskrit is this language that's associated with yoga, um, it used to be reserved only for upper caste communities, right? Only Brahmins could speak and chant a Sanskrit. And if you were lower caste, or if you were in a caste oppressed community and you were seen to be listening to or trying to pronounce Sanskrit, you could be like violently punished. By maybe having like lead poured in your ears or having your tongue cut off, right? Historically, which is really violent, right? And it kind of forced me to see that like Sanskrit, I thought it was this language that my grandmother taught me that was like decolonial, right? Like, me learning Sanskrit is supposed to be, purifying. And it forced me to reckon with the ways in which I had been romanticizing it. Yeah, how Sanskrit was used as a weapon. And and it really forced me to think about how yoga, you know, in the global, like the global perception of yoga is that it's inherently pure, that it's inherently liberatory, that it makes you a better person. Um, and it forced me to kind of think about how yoga is really this tool that's neutral, and it can be used for good or it can be used for bad. And in order for us to apply a truly decolonial lens to it, it's not something that we can like return to the past to find. It's something that we have to work in the present to birth in the future. I think so often we like think that in order to reclaim something, we have to kind of like, go back and get it, or go back to the past to look for like the true meaning of something. But we can also, it kind of just forced me to see that like we can actually work to do that in the present moment, right? And so as I was kind of working on these kind of aspects of decolonizing yoga, mm, through yoga teacher trainings and kind of talking to folks about yoga's appropriation, I started talking more about yoga's appropriation by the far right. By the far right in India, right? The Hindu kind of supremacist class in the state. And then I also started talking a little bit about how yoga is appropriated by the far right in the United States. I had been familiar at the time with the terms like greenwashing and pinkwashing. Um, and if folks aren't familiar, greenwashing and pinkwashing are these strategies that are used by like political institutions or states or governments and companies and corporations that claim to be either environmentally friendly for greenwashing, or that claim to be LGBTQ friendly or women friendly. And they might like promote these green policies or these LGBTQ policies, to promote their public image to make themselves seem more progressive. But in fact, people, scholars and activists have said that these strategies are not in fact environmentally friendly. They're not in fact LGBTQ friendly. And what they do is they divert attention away from the state or the companies, either like capitalist practices or their oppressive or state violent practices, right? And I felt that like I wanted to build on this, right? So I had been studying about, for instance, how police academies in the United States had been developing yoga programs for police officers in training, supposedly to help them work on implicit biases or to help them police better, to give them breaks so that they would think twice, approach policing through a mindful lens. And at the same time that I was learning about these approaches by the police, it was not long after the George Floyd protests, right? And the uprisings that were taking place, and other strings of racist police brutality that were happening in the United States. And social movements on the ground had been saying, we don't want you to invest more in policing. We want you to divest from policing. We support an abolitionist approach. We want you to invest in our communities. We want you to invest in mental health resources. We want you to invest in, you know, uh, community opportunities. We want you to give us more jobs, right? Those kinds of things. Um, and and I think that was when it dawned on me that these were attempts by police academies and cities, who are investing in policing to promote, um, that their officers doing yoga would somehow kind of improve policing, as opposed to kind of listening to communities, right? That were saying, no, we don't want you to invest in policing. Like, we don't want you to use these yoga programs as a distraction. And so that's kind of how the term Omwashing appeared to me, because I was like, oh yeah, this is an opportunity for these uh, companies or these institutions of state violence to kind of cloak their oppression or to distract the public, to make it seem as if they're working on their um, listening to the communities or trying to curb these incidents of police brutality. But in fact, they are meant to distract the public, right? And I think the other kind of like small story that I'll share is that the way that I think about Omwashing is not just in relation to racist policing systems, but it's also something I came to when I was doing my yoga teacher trainings in India. And um, as I was doing my yoga teacher trainings in this town called McLeodganj, India, which is in the north in Himachal Pradesh, um, when I first got there, I remember people inviting me and telling me, oh, things like, oh, you have to go try the falafel at the Israeli place. You know, you have to go to this little village that is called Little Israel, you know? And this was in India. And I remember kind of learning that the reason these places were called Little Israel, or the reason why this food that is, you know, culturally Arab food and culturally Palestinian food that has now been stolen by Israelis and appropriated by them. The reason why there were so many Israelis in India was because so many of them were coming back or coming to India after their compulsory military service, and they were using yoga to decompress from serving in the Israeli military, the occupation army, right? And I started to see that, like, you know, this phenomenon of Omwashing is not just particular to, you know, the US. You can see it in the way that Prime Minister Modi runs India, and uses yoga as a way to kind of conceal his agenda of state violence and ethno-national Hindu supremacy. And you can see it in the way that Israelis use yoga as this tool to either make them better military fighters in an occupation army that is actively, as we know, ethnically cleansing and committing a genocide in Gaza and in the West Bank. And and so I kind of just felt like Omwashing felt like this appropriate term for the way in which I was witnessing that happening. So, hopefully that answers it. I know, again, it was long-winded.
I'm here for it also. I'm here for it. Can only be further edified. I'm gonna put a little time out. Hold on. I'll get back on camera, I guess. But let me just also clarify. Washing, did you pioneer that term or did other people?
I
You did.
did. I did. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. I'm terrible at taking
yeah.
credit. But yeah, it is a term that I arrived at. Um, but largely because I was already familiar with greenwashing and pinkwashing. And um and so I don't think I would have arrived at it without knowing and understanding the importance of like those terms as it related to the ways in which, for instance, Israel talks about how progressive its LGBTQ policies are for, you know, people of the LGBTQ community, while simultaneously using those policies to distract from uh, their brutal assault on, you know, Palestinians in Gaza. And so I had been familiar with greenwashing and pinkwashing and felt like, um, how do I build on these concepts?
Yeah, no, I think you definitely have built on the concept. And yeah, we will get more into, I guess, your research. and the, for lack of better words, your coverage, right? Your coverage of yoga, as you said, not exactly going in the angle of decolonial yoga from at the total appropriation angle of, I don't know, is there appropriation in yoga? But going at it more from these, yeah, a very holistic, um, the dramatic, I guess, range of yoga in a lens of oppression. That there's a much more dramatic stage for it. Um, that I think again is on parallel with our more collective and conscious awareness nowadays of there is systemic oppression, right? We're we our trends our I think our mainstream conversation has been shifting from limited instances of racism, or if you will, to more like, well, what's really happening in a systemic way broadly? What's going on, not just on a national level, but worldwide? How are these systems of oppression interconnected? And then what are the systems of liberation, right, that are interconnected? So I'm grateful that you earlier helped me to also, okay, I'm also guilty of romanticizing aspects of yoga, or I mean, yeah, to an extent, definitely the yoga texts. Um, and what you had said, because maybe I will take back my definition of yoga being freedom. Um, as you had put it, right, it is a tool that is more or less neutral. It is a power that can be used for good or ill. Um, and maybe it can just be put in that lens and, not to get too whatever gearheady or mystic. But of course, right, in like the first Yoga Sutra, or maybe it was the second, yoga was defined as the stilling or the ceasing of the fluctuations of mind, which that could be used toward any end, right? So I'll share one of my yoga weaponization stories. Like, I don't know
Yes.
if I'm smiling and laughing. Like, I don't really always have the opportunity to talk to people about yoga weaponization, but here we
Yeah,
are.
I'm eager to hear it.
Yeah, so there's a quote in an essay by an Ashtangi, who identifies as female, and I mean, I don't follow the teacher very closely, but I had a book and a publication, an ebook, a long time ago, and there was a quote I really liked by Magnolia Zuniga, who said, "Yoga doesn't necessarily make better people, it makes people, or it makes powerful people." I'll repeat. Yoga doesn't necessarily make better people, it makes powerful people. And she noted yoga's potential as a potent tool to widen the imbalance of power dynamics within the yoga community, as yoga is wielded by abusers as much as the abused. Um, Kind of like obviously in the history of religion and groups of people, yoga and definitely even the Ashtanga community has not been immune to, of course, like very to scandals, to very publicized instances of abuse in the mainstream media and the mainstream yoga media, right? Um, and so there is also that topic too in the oppression side of how yoga plays a part in um, the powers that are tapped into of yoga, of just heightened um, I don't know. There are the tools of the yoga technology, right? The energetics and the effect of how things move around. Um, but then also, yes, advancing these agendas of harm, right, among certain people. Um, yeah, my story about the weaponization. So, it was 2018, and I was in Los Angeles on a martial arts retreat. And at that time, I was practicing martial arts because I had just gotten my license in massage therapy. I was working locally in a spa as a massage therapist. And my buddy, who had a martial arts studio, um, he asserted that the best people who can heal also know how to harm, and asserted that there's this relationship between healing and hurting. That the best body workers, in his opinion, were martial artists and people who consciously, um, rather than giving a massage to help widen a joint in the wrist, you could also know how to break that wrist. And the knowledge of how to break the wrist enhances then how to therapeutically address other kinds of joint issues or ranges of um, other kinds of biomechanics, right? So I don't know, wanted to study this further for myself, and I decided to get into some martial art training. It wasn't, I'm not training any longer, but I really enjoyed my time with some martial arts training.
Yeah.
And in that time, I did go to see a Sifu in Los Angeles, whom I enjoyed learning from. He had a background himself in both dance and bodywork massage therapy, so he was a practicing body worker, and of course, like a very renowned, very capable martial artist who had a great school, and has taught brilliant other martial arts instructors and teachers. And at the end of this martial arts retreat, he led everybody in an exercise that was a breathing exercise, a pranayama exercise to kind of close our retreat. And throughout this lovely exercise, um, I call it lovely because I felt a lot of calm, a lot of tranquility. My mind felt more spacious, and I felt more relaxed, right, to just get to the short of it. But I was immediately taken out of this relaxation when I was shocked to find out what he revealed, which was that this same breathing exercise was a technique used by CIA snipers and mercenaries to help control the breathing and the mind enough before pulling a trigger and assassinating somebody.
Wow.
Um, and now, again, like I haven't been in the martial arts world in a minute, and I'm not privy to all of the technologies of using yoga and the systems of the science behind how to
Mm-hmm.
calm the mind and body, and spirit. But that definitely jostled me a bit, and
Yeah.
I didn't know how to personally react to that, but it left me with a contemplation after I left Los Angeles. Um,
I can imagine.
yeah, because like in like contemporary yoga studios, there's usually really lovely, soft, touchy-feely meditations and visualizations that make people feel very good, um, for lack of better words, relaxed um, and at ease, right? Less stress, more relief. So that was a little, and again, I'm not in any also police force or anything, so I don't actually know how officially people train um, to use yoga as a weapon, in that way, or to use the techniques more directly. Um, but I don't know. I thought I would share that story, and yeah, I guess my segue to another question would be that we don't always talk about the shadow sides of yoga or meditation because there are shadow sides, right? That we don't get the press for. As you've mentioned, we there is a tendency to romanticize and see yoga, as you said, as pure or as healing inherently when it might not necessarily be. So,
Yeah. Did you want me to pick up there or?
yeah, I don't know. I guess what I'm
I
saying
think.
is, I think that your research helps start to fill this gap of kind of the gap of awareness of where healing ends and where harm begins, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that story. I think it's of course really jarring as someone who I think, and as we're getting to know each other, right? Like I am learning about your commitment to social justice and your commitment to kind of thinking about healing and wellness in these liberatory ways. And so I can imagine how jarring it was for you to hear this martial arts instructor share what he did about how this technique is used by CIA sniper agents, right? And I think two things come to mind, and hopefully they'll kind of bounce off of each other. Is the first thing that I guess comes to mind is that yes, we live in a context where yoga is somehow kind of like coupled with these notions of healing and purification. I think there's also this association that yoga is inherently nonviolent, right? We get that through the ways in which people maybe pick and choose the connection of yoga to ahimsa, right? Or the connection of yoga to these particular ethical codes, um, such as the namas and or yamas and niyamas, right? That yoga is nonviolent, that yoga is purifying, right? And and then we don't often think about like what that actually means when yoga is connected to the yamas and niyamas is some of those ethical codes are loaded with casteist meaning, right? The namas and yamas and niyamas, um, the way in which they use the notion of nonviolence is often in this way that kind of imposes this idea that in order to be a good yogi, you have to eat vegetarian, right? When in fact we know we live in a system that um, makes it really hard for people who live in cases of structural poverty to be able to even have the luxury of choosing what they eat, right? And so often in India, people are demonized and harassed for the types of meat that they consume, right? Because of the ways in which casteism and Hindu supremacy are embedded into yoga and Hindu philosophy, right? And so I do think that there's this thing that happens where, yoga is romanticized as nonviolent, and then when we learn stories like these, we're like, wait, that's not what yoga's supposed to be, right? I want to believe in the yoga that is nonviolent. I want to believe in the yoga that is about freeing people. I want to be able to tap into the yoga that's healing, for people. And I think there's this discomfort with actually reckoning that we live in a really violent world. We live in a really violent society. Yeah, there is so much violence around us. And not only is there so much violence around us, but all of us um are prone or subjected to an unfathomable amount of imperial propaganda, right? War propaganda to the point where we don't even realize it, right? I think that's another aspect that your story reminds me of, right? Is, this martial artist was kind of saying, like, oh, this technique was shared with CIA agents. And when we actually dig into the depth of yoga's history, we start to learn that, like, yoga and war go hand in hand. The Bhagavad Gita, right, is basically a text that's also about war, right? And justifying war and how yoga can be used in a context of war. And when we go back and look at different histories, there's texts that talk about the warrior yogi, right? About how yoga is used to fuel and make someone much stronger, right? And so, those might not be examples of imperial propaganda, but I think what I'm kind of trying to get at here is that I wonder if like you were particularly shocked by learning this because of your um sensitivity to the amount of like to the way, your sensitivity to and your awareness of um how you want to live in a world where yoga is used for healing, or how martial arts is used for healing and self-defense, perhaps. Um, but if we think about it, like even the article that I read that was written about how, police officers are using yoga and meditation to curb police brutality, right? There's this way in which most people might read that and be like, "Oh, this is a good thing, right? This is a good thing that police officers are using yoga to curb police brutality." There's a video that was circulating at the beginning of Israel's genocide on Gaza, or latest iteration of the genocide in Gaza, or extension of the Nakba, right? Where this Israeli Buddhist named Nissim Amon, he's like a Zen Buddhist instructor, and he's basically made a video for um, Israeli officers, or sorry, Israeli soldiers, to use a certain breathing technique to help them become sharper shooters. And he was like, take a breath before, feel compassion for yourself. Don't feel regret. Don't feel sorrow. Um, and he's basically saying, like, when you take a breath before, you don't waste as many bullets, right? Um, but you can execute and be a sharper shooter, right? And and I remember being really disgusted by it, but also because of the amount that I've been reading about how yoga, there's this longer history of how yoga has kind of often been weaponized or used as a tool, right? Used as a tool by the far right, or there's this history of how yoga has often been used as a tool by um, people of war, right? And so I don't know necessarily why I don't necessarily know why it's not talked about as much, except I think that because we live in such a violent society, there's something there about living in such a violent society where state violence and war are so normalized, right? The US has been at war for what, 90% of its history of existence, and yet, you know and the military budget is sky high, and so it should make sense that the US military and policing groups, are going to be are using yoga. But I think a lot of people don't necessarily bat an eye because we don't realize how propagandized we are. That And so I don't know. Yeah, I know those are a lot of like incoherent thoughts in some ways, but I do think there's something about um how living in a really violent society makes us a little numb to talking about how odd and contradictory it is for yoga to be coupled with these really violent institutions, and these racist and imperial and colonial institutions at that.
I'm gonna definitely gonna contemplate it because it's a lot, right?
It is. You said it's bound to be deep.
Bound to be deep, bound to be deep. Um, it's already been a nice shared conversation so far with lots of deep thoughts. Why don't we talk about your one of your latest projects? You are a co-founder for Yogis for Palestine. Tell us, how did the International Day of Yoga event and project turn out? What were the results? And how is that shaping up so far? I know you had written, and I can put a link in the show notes about already that the International Day of Yoga is also propaganda.
Yeah.
So I can find that article for people curious to see that insight. But tell us, in the context of the International Day of Yoga, which was in June, for the Yogis for Palestine effort, what was it like for you?
Yeah. Thanks for asking about that. It's a project that, of course, in this moment is even more near and dear to my heart. Yogis for Palestine was started in 2021, but in 2023, a few friends and I collectively came together to kind of like build out a solidarity statement, and then we started building on doing donation-based offerings for our community in Philadelphia, and then we did some live stream events in partnership with different organizations to talk about educational events that were fundraisers that basically talked about what are the connections between Omwashing and Zionism, and how do Zionists appropriate yoga, and use it as a tool to distract from genocide and ethnic cleansing campaigns that they are actively um, kind of engaging in this moment, right? And um, last year, we actually, Yogis for Palestine in Philadelphia, did our first International Day of Yoga action for collective liberation, or sorry, Palestinian liberation. And we did it at a local outdoor kind of like wildlife preserve, botanical garden in Philadelphia. Over 100 people, I think, or almost 100 people gathered together to do yoga, and we fundraised for a family in Gaza. And then this past year, Yogis for Palestine teamed up with Thejal Yoga, which is kind of an online-based yoga program that Thejal Patel runs. And we basically developed the rubric for this International Day of Yoga Action for Palestinian Liberation that invited yoga instructors and teachers around the world to host their own kind of similar yoga day within their community to fundraise for a camp in northern Gaza, an educational camp that has been not only just teaching educational programs for children in northern Gaza who've been displaced due to the genocide multiple times and who are, of course, experiencing, an unfathomable amount of trauma in this moment, who are facing, extreme loss and now are facing a campaign of starvation and famine that is being imposed on them by the Zionist entity. And so we basically invited people around the world to engage, to organize and curate their own yoga fundraiser. And I wrote a kind of solidarity statement that we invited people to read aloud, that folks can find on Jadalia, the news magazine that you mentioned. They published it, and we invited folks to read this statement aloud, which I think was really powerful because one of the things that I felt was like really important was to kind of name the ways in which we're doing this yoga to fundraise for this camp in Gaza. And we realize that us doing yoga is not going to end the genocide. We realize that us doing yoga is not going to stop this assault. We're doing it as this way to politicize our yoga toward Palestinian liberation because we know it's important to do this internal work, and we know it's important to fundraise for as a way of providing mutual aid to communities in Gaza, not because we want it to be seen as like a service or some kind of charity type event, but because it's our duty, right? And we know that because doing yoga is just is not going to end this genocide, what we're also inviting people to think about is like, what is the importance of organized political action in this moment? What is the importance of militant political action? And so we do this in solidarity with the boats that are trying to bring aid to Gaza. We do this in solidarity with the political resistance that is trying to stop the Zionist entity from committing a genocide. We do this in solidarity with all of the communities that are on the ground that are trying to provide aid to people in Gaza. We do this in solidarity with the health workers, with the journalists, right? The number of journalists who've been killed by the Zionist entity, targeted, the number of healthcare workers and doctors who've been targeted. And so we felt that it was important as a way to bring awareness, right? To be loud and public about yoga, because so often yogis or yoga practitioners uh, are more politically passive, right? Or think that, like, if we do yoga and pray for peace and light in the Middle East, that's enough. And I wanted us to be clear that we know that this is not enough. We know that, this is the bare minimum. And so that's one thing about, like, that's important for me to share about the International Day of Yoga Action. We ended up getting 170 yoga teachers around the world to register and participate in the International Day of Yoga Action. We collectively raised over $22,000 US dollars, right, to send to this camp in Gaza, um, which, is a drop in the bucket in this moment. But also really powerful to, what's powerful to me is the opportunity to for yoga teachers now to have a rubric, right, of how they can do this over and over again, hopefully, right? Not just once, but maybe you can set up a series in your community. And I think also the importance of Yogis for Palestine is, yes, educational awareness about, you know, why it's important to talk about the harmful weaponization of yoga by the Zionist entity and other members of the far right who are in alliance with Israel right now. And it's important to fundraise and, like, politicize our yoga practice toward fundraising for Gaza and any oppressed community. But I think the other part is really just like how important people have been telling me, that, like, just the amount of care that they felt in these spaces where they feel like their grief has a container, right? Or that they can grieve out loud in these yoga places, in these yoga spaces that are adamantly and unapologetically in support of Palestinian resistance to occupation and ethnic cleansing. And what does it mean to really feel held in those spaces of collective care? And so I think that yeah, I think that the event was a beautiful success. The children in, I should have started with this, but what was really powerful to me is that the camp in Gaza, northern Gaza, basically, Hadil Garbawi, people should look up this camp, Al Jawad camp, and, donate to them if they can. Um, but she did a yoga offering with the kids on International Day of Yoga, um, which just felt like, okay, like, we don't celebrate International Day of Yoga because it's a Narendra Modi holiday, that was started to as a tool of Omwashing or weaponization, but what a powerful reappropriation to see these children in northern Gaza, um, you know, even amidst the buzzing of warplanes above their heads, to maybe hopefully steal a moment of peace, um, as their families are being slaughtered.
Stealing our moments of peace. Goodness gracious. Oh, well, thank you. And all of the 170 teachers and the community that gathered for this support. Yeah, I don't know. That quote, stealing a moment of peace, that really just frames so well, right? This kind of idea. Oh, the grief. Also, yes, I thank you also for holding the container of grief. Right, collectively. I like it's sometimes difficult for me as a person who identifies as American, also Filipina, in the, historic colonizer of of
Yeah.
of the Philippines, in this kind of, also, I don't know, in Europe. We're right now, like, the current prime minister, has his own whatever ideas to address what's going on in Gaza and in Palestine, and I don't know, these ideas of the hypocrisies, right, like Ukraine and whatnot, and how Europe is treating these different nations. But, like, to come back to just like my own personal, like, yeah, like I'm also, I will say, Jewish, from my mother's, I guess, bloodline, and have those roots as well as an American Jew, and or as the joke goes, not Jewish, just Jew-ish. Um, but I wielding, right, as you call it, the positionality of, I do feel sometimes alone here in the sense of the other Americans who live in my community. Well, fortunately, I feel I have some space to talk to some people about it.
Yeah.
But there's also, right, just being in a different culture, a different context. Um, I've also said to people like I'm not really that good of an immigrant, and I'm not really that good of an expat, right? Like I'm not doing the immigrant thing well because I feel this, right, the responsibility of bearing this nationality and this tragedy that's happening on this worldwide scale, of this stage, I should say. But then I'm also not really being an expat either because I could be more in my community here locally. And of course, as much as I feel a lot of integration with my local community, there's always more um, in terms of just feeling integrated. But even though a lot had happened before October 7th, 2 years ago almost, for me, like my in my first year, as I've explained to people, there's been this duality of, on one hand, just a part of me just completely shut down for an entire year, with rage and with grief and anger and frustration and many things that maybe others didn't pick up on until after the election of Donald Trump.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
my grief and my rage were with me for probably a solid year before that.
Yeah.
And now it's like there was kind of this shutdown and all these feelings that don't always have, again, room for the unfathomable tragedy we're all bearing witness to, right? And then, of course, the duality of like falling in love, having a wonderful partner and relationship in my life, and feeling so content in Spain, and feeling so at one and at home and at peace in my environment here. Like kind of this whole, again, the duality of I am suffering and I'm also, in so much joy. How do I really reckon this kind of odd duality? And then feeling sometimes, again, like yeah, in this in between space of being a resident of Spain, but being what I am, and then not always really feeling and understanding how it's been on the ground in the US either in the last 3 years. So it is this really odd. I appreciate is what I'm trying to say, that you have come together with others who want to grieve and want to politicize, right? Actions, right? And you have, again, so much more of a long-term background with organizing and with political movements, to kind of guide people right through different stages of continuing in different efforts, long term, doing long term justice work. But yeah, I mean, there's just like some days not feeling like anything is possible, and other days maybe, representatives can be called and, or whatnot, um, and written to. But I don't know. There's no, I think another one of your essays somewhere you had written, or maybe it was an interview, I'm not sure, that there's not so much always we can do other than just be in these difficult conversations and just be with the discomfort, right? Of not really knowing the right responses all the time and then still making an effort.
Yeah, just naming those contradictions and using that, not shying away from them, but using those contradictions that are probably inherent, not inherent, sorry, but like, yeah, we can, yeah, I think naming the contradictions of yoga and yoga's oppression kind of leaves room for us to, really birth something that can be that much more, that can be intentionally more liberatory. Um, yeah. And And so just, as opposed to shying away from conversations about how yoga is weaponized, I think naming it so that something like Yogis for Palestine can be born, right? I think if yoga is seen as neutral, then it can be used for weaponization, but that means it can also be used for liberatory potential. And so it forces us to be that much more intentional when we name those contradictions.
Sheena, before we wrap up, I'm going to ask three more questions, but we can glop them into one if you want. Um,
Sounds good.
yeah, I guess because again, it's been a very compelling conversation so far, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I wanted to just ask, yeah, care and how to be an individual. Um, let's see where I am in my notes. That there's being an activist or just being anybody in today's day and age. What I call the day-to-day violence of the system that we call our economy. It is hard for anyone sometimes to just a not have the burnout or dissociation amidst the ongoing state-sanctioned violence, dehumanization, erasure, appropriation, all of these things that we've addressed. So, since you've had this background, how do you manage to stay radical and grounded, um, given your knowledge of being in this kind of a landscape and fighting the good fights for so long? Question one. Question two, and we'll review, but question two will be about community care, which is also seen as the goal and the medicine in long term justice work. Where can collective care and community care, I guess, be in our yoga community context? And then finally, we can end with the third question, which is just the future visioning. Um, in this decolonizing approach to yoga that centers collective liberation, healing, and wellness, in your heart of hearts, how do you see this vision unfolding of a yoga community that engages with anti-imperial values and a liberal politics of anti-oppression? So yeah, the wrap up again is question one, individual personal care, two, collective care, community care, and three, the future.
Yeah. Thank you for that breakdown. Yeah. Um, there's an author, well, there's two authors that I want to reference. There's Miriam Kaba, who's this um really inspiring community organizer who um works towards abolitionist futures, who writes in an essay, I think the essay's titled Hope is a Discipline. And I really love that framing of, you know, thinking about, like, sometimes it's like we can feel hopeless about the state of the world and really feel like, what do I do? I just feel hopeless, right? And I think her reminder is an invitation that, you know, it can be a faith-based practice to really work on cultivating hope, right? To really think about like how the work that we're doing may not be something that we see the results of in this lifetime that we're living in. But the reason we do it is because we are imagining towards a more liberatory and abolitionist future that maybe our children's generation will see and be able to kind of know the results of. And so I do think that, like, really trying to work on hope as a discipline has been a helpful remedy at times when I feel hopeless. I'm also subject to feeling the hopelessness or doing the doom scrolling and really feeling as if, you know, the strategies that I'm using aren't feeling effective in this day and time and age. And so that's like one piece. I also think just like grieving in community and being in spaces where you can feel held can feel really empowering, or can help us keep going. Yeah. Um, especially with community who get it, right? Where we don't have to explain ourselves, where we can kind of like be held in our most radical selves, and our most radical visions. Um, I think that um, I do think that kind of answers the question also about community care in some ways, right? Like, you know, again, it kind of comes back to that International Day of Yoga Action and now people having the rubric, right? For this way in which, how do you keep going? Like, if your yoga practice can be politicized to where you can feel like you are able to embody the grief and move through the grief in a community of people who can hold you while you're simultaneously remaining unapologetic in your values and your commitment to what it is you stand for, those sorts of things can, um, I do think like they allow us to figure out ways to sustain this movement and this organizing. And then I also think, like as we need to, like we can't expect to kind of just tirelessly work towards these causes and initiatives. I think it's important to recognize the ways in if we take too many breaks, right? Or if we kind of lean on self-care too heavily, right? Uh, I think that it can feel really individualistic in this like way of like really just like, oh, I deserve self-care. I deserve a bubble bath. I deserve a trip to the spa. I deserve all these things, because I've been doing this activist work. I think that there are ways in which it can still fuel like this commodified capitalist culture. And we have to be really careful of the ways in which we maybe think about taking breaks. But I also think that if you are somebody who's like, okay, I'm going to kind of come back to this work and I'm going to constantly be, thinking about it, then it can really allow us to um, sustain ourselves. Um, and then future visions around, yeah, I mean, I really appreciate the way in which you see me as trying to build this yoga community that engages with anti-imperial values and a liberal, like, I don't know about a liberal politics of anti-oppression, but maybe like a radical politics of anti-oppression. I think I don't know if it's in my heart of hearts, like the most radical imagination of how I see um my vision unfolding, but I do think that one of the things we have to stop doing when we talk about decolonizing yoga is imagining that simply diversifying yoga spaces with BIPOC people, with Black, Indigenous, people of color people, is going to be the solution to decolonizing yoga. I think in order to build an anti-imperial future, uh, we actually have to think about the ethics of how yoga is being used as this tool of oppression and really develop a lens and a framework that pushes back on those specific appropriations that might be by people of color, right? The Indian military actively engages in yoga training to um, strengthen their military who engage in border security, who just, were involved in a war in Indian occupied Kashmir, right? Um, and I think that in order for like us to collectively birth a vision of an anti-imperial, anti-oppressive yoga that is decolonial, and that promises or is centered around this ethos of collective liberation and collective healing and wellness. I think that uh, it would benefit us to really think about the frameworks that we're using when we talk about decolonization and really the ethics, right? So if yoga is being appropriated, or in those situations where the Indian military is doing yoga or Prime Minister Narendra Modi is doing yoga, he's a brown South Asian practitioner. One could see that as decolonial if we have that flat end analysis of representation, right? That could check mark that box. But I think when we actually build a framework, which is why I think Omwashing is important to me, when we build a framework that actually, critiques uh, the ways in which representation is not enough is not the word that I'm looking for here. But it's actually problematic to use representation frameworks, right? Or diversity inclusion frameworks in those situations. And I think actually promoting a framework that invites us to think about the ethical appropriation of yoga, um, and really just imagining it in this way that allows people to really take the medicine they need to meet themselves where they're at, right? The beautiful thing about yoga is that it can deepen our self-awareness of our needs and where we are at, and how we can, just like learn to be embodied in a practice that can, strengthen our bodies, but also condition us to be able to show up for each other. And I think that's like an aspect of maybe how we can think about um, yoga being purposed toward anti-imperial, anti-oppressive politics, and an ethos of collective liberation.
Mm. Well, thank you, Sheena. I love it. A
Thank
needed
you.
framework. I'm sure that your pedagogical, talents and skills and background can serve in developing it, right?
Hmm.
And I appreciate again your work in just being at the forefront, if you will, of just expanding consciousness around yoga in general and deepening this kind of collective conversation in the mainstream around yoga, its functions in society, and ways we can engage with it as people of as age, as moral agents. um, whether we're, I don't know, actually actively engaging in any kind of ritual or not, right? If we're just engaging in the conversation, we have way more perspectives to draw in and think about now, thanks to your work and the conversation that you're expanding. So that's very appreciated. Um,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
I appreciate
So
you.
as we wrap up, for the listeners who are intrigued to keep going, there are definitely great essays that I still haven't gotten into that are really juicy, such as Towards a Critical Embodiment of Decolonizing Yoga, um, among many others. So I'm going to link to Sheena's website in the show notes. You can also check out the website for yogisforpalestine.com with the letter 4, or the number 4, rather. You're invited to follow Sheena on social media on Instagram. There is an Instagram as well and website for a different program we did not talk about in radical uh, healing, which is the Yoga Warrior Tales program for youth and children. Um, I will also link to YouTube, where Sheena has a full season of 7 full length yoga episodes for kids that run approximately 20 to 30 minutes for the Yoga Warrior Tales. And last but not least, you can always sign up for Sheena's newsletter, where there will be a link to follow as well. And my plug again, if not booking Sheena for a service or contacting Sheena about a workshop or a collaboration, would be to read her wonderful words.
Such a
All right.
delight to be in conversation with you today, Sheena. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheena, for such nourishment. And I appreciate again your radicalism. um, yeah.
Lord,
So
to be in touch. Thank you.
thank you. And We'll see everyone on the next episode. Take care.
Yay, see you soon. Bye.
Bye.